Quick overview of what I'm going to be talking about. Basically, it's in the title, Anti-Patterns and Patterns. This is something that actually came, really the idea came from Yarno. He was talking about, well, let's point out some of the things that people sometimes do wrong and that we keep hearing about, and maybe suggest better ways to go about it. I do want this to be more of a discussion. If I put something up there that's an anti-pattern and you think it's absolutely the best way to do it, let me know. I'll tell you why you're wrong. Oh, no, I would like to find out if other people like to cling to these, that they prove useful. I also am guessing that I haven't thought of every problem that you all have run into, so there will be time at the end to discuss traps you may have run into and things you had to do to get out of them. If you saw me last year, everything on this slide is the same, so I won't really bother talking about it. Professional details are unchanged. Personal details changed a bit. I celebrated the release of Daughter 2.0. As you can see, nearly 100% backwards compatible. We didn't add very many new features, but so who's in the audience? Chris already asked a little bit about this, but I'm going to take a slightly different approach. Who here uses the toolkit from the command line? Quite a few, maybe half, several times, okay. Who uses it through something like Oxygen and never really bothers with the official interfaces? More than half, that's good. George, good job. Anybody here consider themselves a toolkit hacker? Okay, not as many as I would have expected. All right, so maybe none of you have run into any trouble with the toolkit, right? How many of you actually support other people using the toolkit, whether you're hacking or not? A fair bit, not too many. And who here is on toolkit 1.8 or earlier? Okay, those willing to admit it, maybe a quarter of the room. 2.0 or later? A few more. Who's not using the toolkit at all? So I think we had about a third of the room not raise their hands. All right. Okay, here's the slide I always put up here to say what I'm going to talk about, and if this isn't what you're expecting, here's your chance to correct me or to go see if the coffee machine is working. So yeah, how people are using the toolkit wrong, how to avoid those things, and maybe some suggestions on better methods. And again, feel free to ask questions or challenge my anti-patterns at any point. So the first one, this slide actually was in my presentation last year. It's the only one I reused, but I had to get some reuse, right? One anti-pattern is just to go in and start hacking away at the code. Because it's open source, isn't that what it's for? You can do what you want. So people go in and just tweak something, whether it's for a new feature or for a fix or something else. Has anybody here done that, willing to admit it? I've done it. Oh, only a couple. Yeah, there are a lot of things that go wrong when you do that. I can tell you from my experience, upgrades immediately become more difficult because you have to port your same hack into the new version you're moving to. It is harder to take advantage of new fixes or features because your hacks are often in code that might get changed, and so you want to preserve your hack, but then you can't work in the new code. Some of this may be obvious to software developer folk. I learned this maybe 10 years ago, but I still fall into it every once in a while. Of course, you might duplicate work that other people are already doing, which is just a waste of time. And it simply may not be possible to integrate with future releases. For that last one, and it may not be possible to share your hacks with other people. I have encountered companies who are stuck on toolkit 1.4 or 1.5, which now I think is 6 years old, something like that, that can't move off of 1.4 because they made so many hacks, and it would cost so much to port those to a new release. And you know, if you keep up with the releases one by one, it may seem like a small amount of work to port your hack to the next one, depending on how big it is. If you wait 3 releases, all of a sudden it becomes daunting. If you wait 3 years, suddenly you're worried and you may be stuck forever. So what do you do instead? Well, that varies depending on your skill level, your time, what you're doing. Plugins are the best way to incorporate your own features. That's what my talk last year was about. That's why the previous slide was in that. I was warning people against the same pitfall. If you're just fixing a bug, no matter how you go about it, please, please, please open an issue so that we know about it, so that others can get the fix, whether you're providing a fix, whether you're asking for a fix. Really, it's important. That's one of the easiest ways to contribute to the toolkit, is to let us know if something's wrong. The issue page does now have a link to contribution guidelines, whether you're contributing code or simply contributing an issue, where we remind you that it's really helpful if you state what toolkit release you're using so that we don't have to go back and ask. Things like that. And then, of course, if applicable, if your company allows, depending on what you're doing, contribute the change back to the toolkit. I also say if applicable because, for example, in IBM, we've got a few overrides to the toolkit. We've got some pretty complex plugins that really no one else in the world wants because it's like IBM branding. And so there's no reason to contribute that, but we do isolate it in the plugin. When working on PDF, for example, it's like, well, we need support for a lot more languages than were in there as of 2.1. That's why there are now 15 new languages supported in the PDF code. Any questions about that one? All right. This one I call overloading the one true transform. This is something that has tripped up my team, myself. Sorry. It has tripped me up in the past. And it actually took me a long time to break out of this one, to realize what an anti-pattern it was, where we had people who wanted to build XHTML. And then, within IBM, I support something like 1,000 writers, 1,400 writers. And so we have a bunch of teams that come in and say, I want the HTML to do this, and nobody else wants it. And then somebody else says, well, I want it to do that. And so we keep adding options. And then all of a sudden, we have to produce HTML for a new platform. For example, in IBM, everything now is on what we call Knowledge Center. And so we say, well, okay, we need this new output for Knowledge Center, but we don't want anyone to think of a new HTML transform, so all of a sudden we've got a whole set of new options just for Knowledge Center. They only apply when you're doing the HTML transform for Knowledge Center. You can drown in parameters. And so the pattern I suggest is to step back and realize that on this screen, we've got a bunch of parameters that include arg1, arg2, arg3. But XHTML is a parameter. Why not just change that one? And so we say XHTML-A with all the predefined options, XHTML-B, XHTML for this guy, XHTML for that guy. It's all XHTML. We call it a new transform type, but it's all HTML, XHTML, HTML5, whatever. Just step back and think that you don't need to overload the same transform for all of your different outputs, for all of your different customers, different audiences. Does anyone else run into that? Or again, is this just me? Well, Elliot's run into it, so I'm not alone. I'm in some sort of company. All right.
Well, I think one issue is that setting up a new transformation type in an authoring tool was difficult until we'll see more Lightning code that it's easier now. But
yeah.
Setting up a new transformation type was not that straightforward.
Yeah. And I really don't remember when I had this realization, but it was probably Jarno banging me over the head. He said, I'm trying to get PDF to work for all these different people, and so can I add this option and this option? And he said, well, really, that should just be a new transform type. And then you just have one option, you set that option, and everything else is predefined. And you may still have a few things that you're passing in, but most of it can be predefined based on that. Anti-patterns, start command in the Java command line. Does anyone here still use the Java command line? Elliot. Elliot is on his own in this one. Okay, I don't really talk about that. It was added years ago, slightly simpler command line syntax than ant, but it was still ugly.
No, I'm sorry. I use
Oh, okay. Elliot's walking back. He doesn't use the Java command line. Okay, good. I was kind of hoping it wasn't in use anymore. It's been deprecated for quite a while. Yeah, there was a lot of stuff, bad stuff going along with it, but it was in use for several years. Start command. Who likes start command? Who uses start command? I saw a couple of people start to raise their hands, suddenly look ashamed, and then pull them down. Good for you. I'll talk in a little bit about why start command is a bad idea for the few of you that use it. That's the lightning talk. But yeah, the DITA command line interface, that's where we should be moving. Here's the one that I hope draws some controversy, because controversy is fun. Customizing more than you need. And I know that there are people that do this. I know that there are people that recommend this as a best practice. It's one that I do not agree with, although I think in some cases it's maybe justifiable. In many, it's not. So the issue here is customizing one template among many. And so if you're working, this usually comes up with PDF, but it could come up with anywhere else with XSLT. If you are customizing one template inside of a file that has many templates, what do? Do you copy the one template you're changing into your own override, and then as you discover you need to override more, you copy more templates and more templates? Or do you just copy the whole thing and then just tweak as needed? I would suggest one at a time. There are a lot of reasons for that. Others suggest doing the whole thing. But I know it has caused trouble. Radu mentioned this as something that Oxygen users have run into, where I think they end up submitting bug reports because it causes the trouble. And the problem that results is, what happens when you've copied 50 templates or 100 templates because you're changing 3 or 4, and then in the next release of the toolkit, something changes in 20 of those templates. You don't get those changes. You don't know things have changed. And so all of a sudden, your code might start to go off on weird paths. You might start to get strange results. You might even get something where your template is missing. You get errors. So really, a light touch, copy as little as you can, is the safest approach. And another thing I'll note here, if the template you're overwriting is really big, so you're having to copy 50 or 100 lines of code, that shouldn't happen anymore. But if you find one that's like that, you can open an issue and say, I think this should be smaller so that I can really do a light touch customization. Early in the toolkit, as many of the early developers, myself included, were learning XSLT, we would have templates that had 50 or 100 lines in it. And so then if I needed to customize something, I'd have to copy the whole giant thing. Same issue that I just described. If the next release changed one line in the middle of that, I was out of luck. So yeah, ask for them to be broken down, refactored. So the example here in the XHTML, the main file that has XHTML rules has 226 templates. If you need to customize one of those and you copy all 226, you are wasting a lot of time with duplicate maintenance. You're going to miss a lot the next time that file gets updated. PDF is where this more commonly occurs. The common set of rules has 138 templates. There are 162 attribute sets in the equivalent attribute set file. Front matter, which is something that I think you might look at and say, well, there's not very many. I can just copy the whole thing. There's still 11. If you're only updating 1 or 2 of those, you're probably going to miss the fixes that came into 2.2. There were fixes in that file. Any questions about that? Anybody want to disagree? Oh.
Not to disagree, but just to note that XSLT 3.0 will have XSL packages where you can kind of expose an interface to a package so you can say what's private and what's public. And that will allow this to say what they expect to be customized to this control that functionality.
And that's something that I think from our perspective might be described as an anti-pattern of XSLT itself. That, so how many templates are there in the commons.xsl? 138, and we can't mark any of those private. And so that means you can go in and change every one of those whether we expect you to or not. If the developers were somehow able to say, here are all the things that control formatting, have fun with them, but here are all the other functions that do the real bulk of the work, and try not to touch those because that's where more logic exists. It'd be a lot safer for us to change the logic, to fix the logic, and it would be a lot safer for you to customize just what you know affects rendering, for example. That's not possible today, but it sounds like we may be moving towards that. Oh, Yarno was waving his hand. What was that? Code Commons might help? Maybe. It could. Yes. Yes, Yarno? Sure. About code comments, I will say that a lot of the code that's in there, one problem with it is that it's grown over 10 years, and it's hard to go back and add to code from 10 years ago. Yeah, but go on.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I had an idea for marking things private and public by using namespaces. So you stick all your private stuff onto a namespace, which would be don't touch this private. But the problem is, if you do that, all the existing customizations break. And that's one of the things we have developers who can't change anything because then everything breaks for users, and if you have unhappy users, you have fewer users in the future. So we would really like to change this, but unfortunately we can't without breaking things. Sometimes we want to break, and we'll break things in OT 3.0, but right now we're not going to do it.
Yeah, if you have millions of users with programs that are absolutely critical to the functioning of a government or an airplane or something, you're a little bit more at liberty to break things because they have to adapt. If we break stuff, people just get mad and leave. So, yeah. PDF customization directories, does anyone still use those just on their own? Only a couple admit to it. Oh, another one in the back, okay. Yeah, customization directories came in to the toolkit with the PDF2 plugin. At the time, the toolkit had plugins. It had a way to extend the toolkit. When Idiom contributed the PDF2 plugin, they came up with their own completely separate thing. And then, of course, this was all given as a package. And so it came with customization directories. You can now do any of that stuff with plugins, which is really the recommended way to do it. That's the supported way to do it. Customization directories still work. Again, we don't like to take the ball and go home, but they are deprecated. One of the things that came up when I was discussing this presentation with the other toolkit developers is that, hey, wouldn't it be great to have a page in the documentation that described how to convert your customization directory to a plugin? Roger, is that done yet? You've had like a couple of days. No, not yet. Okay, but hopefully that's something that's coming. Yes? In Did It for Print from Lee's book? Yeah. I will say Lee is one of those who recommends copying an entire XSL file, and that's where I expected there to be some controversy, but she's not in the room, so I guess I'm safe. Anti-pattern, tying unrelated features together into a great big knot. And when I say this, there are a couple of things I mean. From your own maintenance perspective, if you are creating a bunch of plugins, you can set them up so that every plugin says, I depend on this other plugin. And if you're building plugins that do 20 different things, they can all depend on each other in such a way that it becomes impossible to tease out a single feature. I won't name any names, but I've run into this with some people in the room who contribute a lot of plugins, and it becomes difficult to pull things apart. I believe that's been addressed now for the most part. It's also the case with some of the older plugins, like the Plus plugins. Does anyone still use the Plus plugins? No? Okay. Those were created by Deborah Pickett several years ago and were really popular for a while. Among other things, they could turn the syntax diagram markup into SVG output, and I've had great trouble tearing that code out so that I could use it without all of the other stuff that went along with those plugins. So that's one of the best examples, I think, of the knotted up code. The other thing from the toolkit perspective is submitting a whole bunch of features together as one big pull request, where it's difficult for the team to evaluate any of those features in isolation, or to determine whether they're broadly applicable. If you submit 20 things, it might be that the world really needs 18 of them and the world will be annoyed by 2 of them. So it's harder to figure that out. So the preferred approach, sorry, preferred approach is to isolate functions when possible into their own plugins. It's easier to test, it's easier to share, it's easier to contribute, it's easier to reuse. It's more fun because you have more directories. I don't know. It's a good idea. Any questions about the previous one? Any questions about any of these? No, nothing. I'm getting the sense here that no one here has any trouble with the toolkit or ever does anything wrong, which on the one hand is great, on the other hand might mean I'm wasting your time. So the anti-pattern, we'll just sort of redo the scripts. This was unfortunately something that my team did in IBM with the toolkit, where we had our existing infrastructure, ours was based on the SGML process. And then we pulled the toolkit in and said, we have all these scripts for building SGML, we want to use all the toolkit, so let's just use our scripts and call all the toolkit modules. And wow, that caused us long-term pain over the last 10 years. It's taken us 10 years to get away from that model, and we're finally moving to the model of just calling the toolkit. Everything's a plugin, as it should be. It became very difficult for us to upgrade and add new features. It became difficult because when the toolkit was upgraded, our scripts still only called the old modules. If a module changed, our stuff broke. If a module was added, our stuff didn't call it. So it was a pain. Honestly, I don't know if anyone else has run into this, because I think we are kind of quirky in the way that we created the toolkit, contributed it, and then pulled it back into our existing stuff. I don't know if anyone's faced anything like that, but for me, this has been the most painful anti-pattern to break out of. General anti-patterns when using XSLT with the toolkit. I think these were suggested by Elliot, except for the last one. Elliot wanted to make sure we all use 2.0, like good XSLTers. Use name templates, avoid using name templates, rather. Use mode when possible. I've tried to switch over. I think there is still a place for name templates at times, but try to use mode whenever you can. And then priorities. I'll just note that with the way the toolkit works, with everything being imported, lots of import precedents based on specialization, if you throw a priority into the middle of one of those and then something else is imported later, it's not going to work. The specialization hierarchy lines up really well with the XSLT hierarchy, and as soon as you throw a priority in there, you sort of break everything. So avoid those. Okay, so we're approaching the end. George, I'm worried I didn't draw this out. Should I turn to the side and cough for 10 or 15 minutes? Just no. Generally, the idea I want to promote is that if you're going somewhere with a toolkit and it starts to look kind of dicey, if you think like you might be going in the wrong direction, before it gets too bad, take a step back and maybe see what other people have done, so that you don't end up like this, because nobody wants to end up like that. So, any difficulties you run into with the toolkit, anything you would consider maybe an anti-pattern that you want to discuss, bring up, ask for assistance on? Don't know.
Hi. So, the anti-pattern I've seen, at least in my own code is that when you have some processing that modifies the DITA-OT, doesn't publish it into anything, just modifies it, does something funky with it. Don't stick it in your PDF or HTML transformation. Create a separate module for the pre-processing and share it in your trans-type specific code. I think that's one of the anti-patterns that you could move some of the processing into the pre-processing step. Well, it doesn't have to be really in the pre-processing step, but in a way, when processing the content, separate it as a separate module. The module would be just XSLT, and then DITA in, DITA-OT, and it's easier to debug it because you can actually go and see the results of your rewrite of the code, and that yes, now I've underlined every mention of word X or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. A lot of things, if you're working on a customization to a new output, something in there might not be at all unique to that output. And if you tie it into your customization for that specific thing, it's, again, harder to tease it out and use it separately. I just ran into this recently working with the new toolkit customizations we're doing. We're producing our output, and I'm guessing no one here uses syntax diagrams, so this might be a little bit meaningless, but we have a program that turns them into text output, and I tied that into our HTML code. So whenever you did the IBM HTML, you get these text diagrams. And suddenly I realized that I was also going to need those text diagrams in our text output and in our PDF output. And so, yeah, it's a function that makes sense on its own. I tied it into our HTML, and then the next day I had to untie it and make it a separate plugin on its own. So if you can isolate features like that, it's a lot easier to reuse them. It's a lot easier to test them. Stuff like that. Any other comments, questions? Elliot?
I just mentioned that Oracle uses syntax diagrams.
Oracle uses syntax diagrams. Do you know if they use the plus plugins to publish them?
I was going to say, yes, so Oracle uses syntax diagrams, so like in their SQL reference, that's how syntax diagrams. I don't believe they use the plus plugins.
The plus plugins are the only way I know of to get usable output outside of IBM. In IBM, sadly, we still rely on an old C++ program that was written for SGML that doesn't fit in the toolkit. Like it's a monster and nobody maintains it.
I think they actually have their own tools for generating syntax diagram graphics actually from the source code for from which the syntax diagrams are also generated.
Interesting. Well, interesting to me. Probably not interesting to anyone else in this room. Sorry. Any other issues people have run into? Anybody developing the code, have you run into a problem you're willing to admit to that you couldn't figure out why you were going the wrong direction? Oh, we have one over here. Oh, back up, George. Ah, yes, 1.5. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, wow. I can see that. Yeah, the documentation, we started out in the first couple of years of the toolkit, we had a couple external contributors that wrote some documentation, then they disappeared. For a few years, nobody did anything, which was very sad. Then, I think, right around 1.5.4 or something like that, near the end of the 1.5 releases, I went in and, it was sort of as time permits, I cleaned it up as best I could to try to fix the glaring errors, to try to fix misspellings of parameters, add parameters that I knew had been added. So I tried to clean it up as well as I could. It wasn't until really we went to Git and started publishing documentation by release and having dedicated people on the documentation that it really got cleaned up and good. Until then, yeah, it was the developers working in IBM China would add everything, and then it would go out there, and then I would say, oh my goodness, no one documented this. Let me see what I can do. And that's kind of how we did it. So yeah, if you can, move to a newer release. The anti-pattern there is staying on 1.5, because yeah, no one's touching documentation for that. That release is 5-6 years old now. So yeah.
I think it could be a good idea to have an end-of-life policy for the DITA-OT.
It would be nice.
Which version is actually end-of-life and is not supported anymore?
I would say in terms of support, there are people on DITA users that will help you support anything, but in terms of the toolkit itself, I know Jarno's pretty much interested in the latest development code and nothing else. I'm generally interested in the latest stable release, maybe one or two back, depending on what my IBM code is at.
And also that it's about usually to go from one use to another,
Yeah.
and then just keep and go to. Yes.
It's not as easy to do an end of life.
Just start it.
Yeah. Well, I don't know what level all the editors are at. I know Oxygen is always on the cutting edge with it. I think XMetal's fairly up to date, but I don't know. From talking to a couple of their developers, I thought they were up to date. Arbortext, I don't think uses the toolkit. They did everything on their own. They from day one with DITA, they wrote everything on their own. They put a lot of money into rewriting everything.
Okay, short question. Typically, you were talking about this function of loading, which is needing incremental changes to the documentation. So you have a special case. The current commons, etc., does have around 2,100 lines. And during the last half year, I have made a lot of extensions, which I'm going to present at lunchtime. Now it has 5,000. You cannot do incremental changes if you do so many changes. And of course, I think people will appreciate the change because we will make documentation of it. But is there any other paths to, let's say, get those words in?
Not a good one. That's where we run into a whole lot of changes all together, and it's hard to tell how many of those everybody wants, how many of those should be parameterized, that sort of thing. Yeah, it's hard. That's one of the things with our generic output. People always complain that the output looks boring, and in many cases, that's because everybody wants to customize a little bit in their own way. And so if we put in a whole bunch of changes that make it look really nice based on one person's style, a lot of people are going to have a harder time getting back to their own style. So yeah, I don't know. I really hate to not have a good answer to that, because I'd love to be able to say, if you have this beautiful PDF, here's how we get it in. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We'll see later, but that's for everybody.
Yes. Yes, and I'm anxious to see it. Yes.
Sorry, I just wanted to follow up on the comment about the outdated documentation of one time. I'd just like to encourage, if you do find something that's missing or wrong with even the old documentation, do report it. I can't promise that we'll get any changes made to old versions of the documentation. But there are things there that may be wrong or maybe missing. It may still be wrong or missing in the current versions. So if you're stuck in an old toolkit version and you see something about documentation that you'd like to improve, let us know, because maybe the people that are using the new version of the toolkit just haven't noticed that that's missing. Because that parameter is important to them, because perhaps new versions of the toolkit don't make use of it or something like that. So I really encourage everybody, if you find something, even if it's an old version of the documentation, do let us know, send an issue, even better send a pull request, but let us know if there's any way we can make it offline.
Yeah, and there is a separate, at GitHub, we have one spot for like code issues, everything related to the toolkit, and there's a separate one for docs. And so you can go there and not feel like you're diving into ugly code stuff with also, yeah. Yes, Elliot.
With respect to the PDF, so one of the talk to do about the community project. If you have created, what you think is a nice set of files, different set of files in PDF, one way to make them available would be to put them in the plugin and contribute to the community project.
Yeah, provided they're in a plugin, yeah.
Yeah, they do need to do it. With respect to what Ron was saying about pre-processing, I 100% agree. One thing I've observed is that a lot of the work that Ron has done recently is to propose data code with XSLT in the pre-processor. And what that
That said, I'm surprised Jarno didn't hit you over the head while you were saying that, because I know Jarno's preferred approach would be to make the pre-process a black box and you don't customize it.
Yeah, that's not gonna work.
Well, that's not going to work for you. It might work for most people, which is what we're hoping. You shouldn't have to in most cases. Elliot, I know you've got some pretty complex requirements, but, and I've customized the pre-process as well. I would like to not have to do that. I think in a lot of cases, my stuff could come immediately after the pre-process so that it remains a black box, and then we do stuff. But
Yeah, well, you made a distinction between customizing the pre-process and changing the pre-process.
Right.
And extending the pre-process and having additional pre-process.